You're a failure.
And that's okay. Hi, I'm Dan.
And I'm Alicia. And we're
failures
too.
We take a walk back through people's failures and relive the mistakes they made so we all can have more clarity in how to be a better human.
Have you ever been so close to finishing something big that you can almost taste the victory? And right before the finish line, you were forced out of the race as if it were your choice? On this episode, our guest is a former Army psychologist whose bubbly nature did not fit the typical profile of someone serving in the Army. Even though she was crushing it in the program, in the last few months, she was asked to resign from her psychology residency in the U.S. Army. Rosie Hunter takes us along her story where, as she says, pulled a Miley Cyrus and came in like a wrecking ball to a world of conformity, rank, and push-up requirements. Rosie's journey left her questioning her identity and psychology skills while experiencing mind games, shame, and confusion. Find out how she finally transformed her perspective about her failure after receiving a Bronze Star medal from her deployment in Afghanistan. Welcome to the 2020 Perspective, Rosie Hunter. So thank you, Rosie, for being here with us today.
Glad to be here.
So bring us back to the moment where this all begins.
Yeah, so this all begins with the fact that my PhD is in clinical psychology. So my clinical training involves graduate school, where you do a master's and a research dissertation. I went to a very academic graduate school. And then you do an internship and a residency. Most people do an internship and a residency.
Mm-hmm.
And I joined the Army for my internship because I wanted to go to Walter Reed and I wanted to be in Washington, D.C. because I had done a semester at the White House and I love government and I love the Civil War. And I thought, I'm able-bodied and I just am really expressive for an academic. So I want to go and join the Army and be like the best Army psychologist ever.
Wow.
So yeah, so I did that. And I did great in internship. And I ended up resigning under pressure from the residency program.
What?
Right?
Okay.
Right?
Hooked.
And that was like considered a monumental failure in my very academic family and in my very perfect brain. But in retrospect, there's a lot of different things that I did that made it sort of inevitable. So that's my major failure in my life that I'm ready to just talk about.
Okay, you said internship went great. What do you mean by great? What about this?
So that's a great question, right? Because I was at least like people laughed out loud when I told them that I joined the Army, because I am just very perky. I am very, people would say girly or traditionally outgoing. I have very much my own sort of, I'm very compliant and dutiful, but I kind of just say what I want, and I have a very kind of whimsical spirit to me, not the stereotype of an Army officer. So when I joined, I went to boot camp, people were like, oh my gosh, good luck. And I ended up having this senior role, and I just figured it out, right? Like I got it in my head and I figured it out. When I got to Walter Reed, I was one of the only interns that had research publications. I had a very strong background in not just research, but also teaching undergraduates and graduates. And what comes with that is a lot of confidence talking to groups, which the Army loves, and a rote memorization of a lot of things related to psychology, right? Because if you teach the same things over and over and over, people ask you these questions, you get really good at talking about those things. So I also had the instinct, and still do, to kind of be a show-off. Most psychologists are actually introverts and sort of reluctant to take up too much room. But, we had all kinds of different amazing guest speakers, and I was quick to raise my hand and say, what my ideas were. And I had studied the long history of the military. And so I was just doing really well. I don't know if it was because of my height or the way I wore my uniform, but I tended to be in the middle of the pictures. And I just, it just went really well. I was surviving and thriving, and I loved all the different rotations. I found them fascinating. Like I loved doing neuroscience, where we got to talk to people at the point of impact on the battlefield. Like we were talking to people in Afghanistan about what happened to someone who had just showed up at Walter Reed. And then we were talking to their families. I just loved it. Like the whole thing was great. Residency is a much more individual kind of track. That's that postdoctoral part. And I started going, instead of with my crew of my Army interns, you start going to installations as an individual. And I did really well with the first set of those things. And then we moved my mom to DC, and she had cancer at the time. I mean, she had cancer for a decade. So it was just sort of this on and off real struggle, stage 4 lung cancer. And I was at this independent residency that didn't require a lot of me being there. And I had joined the Army. This is another thing that's important. The Army hadn't paid for my undergrad or my graduate school or anything. So I had a very limited obligation. I think that got to my head too, where I was just like, oh, I'm really good at this. I'm great. If I need to take an hour or two to go check on my mom, that was a very normal thing to do in academia, right? So I thought that I was exempt from those minor things related to the Army. So I gave myself some allowances that ended up biting me big time in the ass. I didn't, I was professionally too immature to realize that it's not, most careers are not about your best days. They're sort of about, in some ways, they're about your worst days. And then I got stressed out, focused on this other stuff. And there's one specific morning. So the major who was in charge of our residency program, I didn't realize at the time she was bringing down our residency program. She was like literally taking it apart and sending it to another installation. So I was one of 3 left. I was supposed to do a report on a fictional patient. And instead of doing it, I slept in and went to the hospital and called them and said I was going to be like an hour and a half late. And by the time I got there, she had reported me AWOL.
What? That's extreme.
So anyway,
so you went to the hospital to see your mom?
Just to check on her, just to get eyes on, because that had been my mission for the years before, in addition to being in academia. Yeah.
And so wait, rewind. First detail. Report on a fictional patient. Is that kind of normal in a residency kind of thing?
It's not unusual. So I was doing the forensic part, and this is there were days when they'd like drop me off in New Jersey by myself to do an IQ test on someone accused of rape. Just like, and then drive yourself back when you're done. Okay. It was all forensics, people who determining competency to stand trial, things like that. And these reports come along rarely enough that sometimes they have 2 people write the same report. One of them is the real one, and that's done. You write it up. It's a real patient, but it's not a real patient to you. A real client, it's just not a real client to you. You write it up to be evaluated on what you write up.
Oh, so it's like a double check. That it's an existing person, but it's not really being used for the purposes of like actual decision. It's just kind of like a, hey, do your homework,
Right.
Okay.
So you make it the file on a person who is long gone through the process, and you write it up, and they just sort of evaluate your write up.
Got it.
Okay.
I have a question as well. Let's rewind a little bit. When you were saying that some of the things that you did in academia that you kind of, I don't want to say take advantage of, but it was just, more normal, the different things that you did, like go check on your mom or whatever, when you got noted as being AWOL, like what were some of the other things that you were doing that you didn't realize were like a faux pas?
There's a couple different things. So in academia, you get evaluated constantly for your clinical ability, for your research writing, for a lot of different things. When you go to the Army for a medical training program, you get evaluated for all of those things and this other huge genre of stuff that is just sort of generic military officership. And that involves things like your PT test.
What does PT stand for?
Physical training.
Okay.
So their Army physical fitness test at the time, now it's much more complicated, but at the time it was just push-ups, sit-ups, 2-mile run.
Okay.
And we still had to do that when we were in training, but they were like, okay, so we can't kick you out for this if you fail it, but it's still a big deal. And in my head, I was like, if my major professor said, this is not going to cost you any problems, he would say, spend no time on it, right? Like, if this doesn't matter, spend no time on it. So they would say, this doesn't matter. Okay, so I did dumb stuff. Like, I didn't quite know how many push-ups I had to do for my age and gender.
Okay.
So, I'm doing the push-ups, and I don't actually know if they count it when you're up or when you're down. Same with the sit-ups. I didn't know if they counted it when you're up or when you're down. Turns out it's when you're down. So if you fail your sit-ups by 1 and you fail at the top, that means you could have just flopped back like a fish and gotten the points for that sit-up. So I didn't remember things like that, so I would fail PT test from not counting. which is
Wow.
anathema
Oh
in the
my
Army.
gosh.
And then I would all perky go tell my supervisor, oh, it's okay. I just forgot. I just wasn't counting, which is offensive
Oh
in
no.
the military. Like, who does that?
I'm seeing this as two different phases. There's the internship, which you said you were a rock star at, and then there's
Right.
the residency, which you said there were all these kind of like problems that started to float up when you meshed this clinical piece with the military piece. And so
Yeah.
was it did you change from the internship to the residency, or did just your priorities shift?
That's a good question. I had a priority shift, right? Because we brought my mom to DC specifically because she would be closer to me and my brother who was there. So we had priority shift in that sense. And I also didn't have the inertia of the group, right? And I am just such an extrovert that if they were all like, hey, Rosie, let's go do a practice PT test so that we don't screw up for dumb reasons, I'd be like, okay, I love you guys. Let's go do it. And when they weren't there, it wasn't like I would do that kind of thing on my own because I knew in the back of my head that it didn't actually matter. And then I'd misinterpret the Army idea of, the Army says, don't ever show up with your supervisor with a problem, always show up with a solution. And I would present a solution like in my perky, oh, this is great. Here's a plan. It's going to work. How you doing? And so then, like, I did that with the PT test, with the physical training test, where I missed the push-ups, and I got written up for disrespecting a field grade officer, I think, which I was like, huh? I've been saying ma'am and sir since I was an infant. I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida. I don't know what this is about. I was honestly just confused. Like, I thought if I wanted to be disrespectful, that had to be intentional. I didn't realize that you could be unintentionally disrespectful. And that's an Army idea, that you can be unintentionally disrespectful and you can be punished for that. So,
How did you feel when you found out that you got written up for something that you did not intend to do?
confused, honestly. I just was really sort of naive. In my organizational life, I've done a lot of tests. You're familiar with the Hogan personality inventory, and one of the things it has on there is derailers, and there's one about basically about how suspicious you are, and I was very low on that, right? To the point where it suggested that I might have difficulty understanding organizational politics, right? But that's the whole thing about the Army, right? You police minor things because you can't afford for that sort of for everybody to grow and own their own independent set of rules, because then it would be chaos. So it took me a while to really understand that I wasn't an exception to that.
So let's go back to the story. So you're doing your clinical work and you're starting to get this friction. At what point did that friction really start to drag on you, or was there like a turning point? Was there like a plot twist that led to the resignation?
So there's this whole separate chain of command in DC. She's in charge of the interns in our training. Once you report somebody AWOL, this other set of command, clicks into effect, and they start evaluating you. And when you're in that evaluating status, while they're trying to figure out, some colonel who's never met you is trying to figure out if you can go on in the Army, you have to be in this holding pattern. Once I got in that holding pattern, it was like head spinning around, exorcism, treated like terrible. And there's this layer and layer of shame, which I was willing to accept to some extent. But then it started just getting utterly, bizarre. Once you report someone AWOL, then that major just dumps all her paperwork on this other group that starts to investigate me. And the last rotation in the residency was going to be at this installation that's in upstate New York that has a relationship to Walter Reed. So while I'm up there, this independent entity is doing this investigation, and she finds out from them that she's not allowed to send me anywhere when somebody's under investigation. Because if you think about Army, like, sexual harassment stuff, if someone's under investigation and you send them off, you're sort of getting them out of that. There's all kinds of rules related to that. Ask Congress, I don't know. So she had to call me back from this other training, and she decided that, wow, that's got to be really devastating. Drive 8 hours directly to the inpatient unit where you used to treat people and get evaluated for suicidal ideation or intent, by a junior psychiatrist. And there's nothing sadder than a psychiatrist in training.
Oh.
Because they get 15 minutes with people. They're terrified. Like psychologists are just, we get an hour with people. We have more understanding of rapport, all that kind of stuff. His poor bright wide eyes. And I was just like, dude, what are you doing right now? He's like, they told me to. I mean, I know we've had class together and I'm sorry. And I'm like, well, go ahead. Ask your question. And then I was giving him advice. You really shouldn't ask it that way.
Oh my gosh. I wish I could have seen this.
Yeah. Well, I went full smug mode at that point. I swung all the way back from my naive, deferential, too Pollyannish to like, okay, if we're going to play games, let's play games.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Once that new command structure clicked in, you got bounced. Your old orders to bounce up far north to New York and then get called back. And you were called back explicitly for this evaluation?
Explicitly to sit around and wait for those other people to investigate what had happened.
Got it. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I got emails that said, you're not allowed to talk to the interns in training. When once upon a time, when they were recruiting interns, I was the face of the program. They would come to Walter Reed. I would lead
You're the poster child.
Internship tours. Yes, I was the poster child. I was all dressed up and, I was supposed to do all that stuff. And now it was like, don't come to this part of the building because we don't want you influencing them negatively. Wow. Like just repeated shame related to that. Calls
script.
From her at 10 o'clock at night, like, are you throwing up? If I were you, I'd be throwing up.
What?
Like, I'm like, no, I'm not throwing up because I haven't been drinking today. Like, what are you talking about? Yeah. So it was fun when that went on 4 months. Do you hear me? Months. And I used the time to get really good at Excel, and I built this big project for the training department. And it was easy for me to geek out on Excel, but I wasn't seeing patients. I was sort of slowly losing my identity as a clinical psychologist. But the colonel who did the investigation essentially wrote, yeah, she's sloppy in some ways, and she should probably let you know if she's going to be late, more in advance and da-da-da-da. But then he told me offline, like, are you psychologists just getting together, playing all kinds of head games with each other? And he wrote a letter that would stay at Walter Reed and said, this isn't a dishonorable discharge. This isn't a demotion. This isn't whatever. Just like go on and live your life.
Uh-huh.
But by that time, the residency program was over, and I wasn't going to fight to re-enter it. And the big colonel in charge of psychologists, said, you're going to go the 101st Airborne, and I'll never forget his words. He was like, here's my advice to you. Fill it and kill it. Nobody cares if a psychologist has a residency. Go down there and fill it and kill it. I was like, really? He's like, yeah, you can leave all of that here. Sweet.
That's a nice validation.
So they're just saying, like, forget the drama in school. Just go out and do
do your job well.
But the folks who had sort of pushed me out of the residency program had said, we're doing this because no one in the Army is ever going to take you seriously, right? Like a battle-hardened, if you were to go on in the Army, the next person you're going to work for is a battle-hardened colonel, and he's going to have to believe everything you say about his, soldiers and about risk and about all that kind of stuff, and nobody's ever going to believe you. And we hope you get better, but we doubt that you will.
Well, I want to know what you're thinking, because it sounds like you started this journey to go into the Army because you wanted to go into something like a little bit different and test your skills in a different way. But were you thinking, oh, I'm going to do this forever? So as you're hearing this feedback, like what's going through your mind?
Yeah. I wasn't thinking I'm going to do this forever, because I probably joined when I was 29 or 30. But I was thinking that as a psychologist, I was very confident in my training and that I could apply that to any situation. So when they're saying things like that, my thought was, maybe I can't apply it to every, situation. Maybe maybe I should go hide out in academia and just write letters from an ivory tower. I thought I could hold two things in mind. I know there's something wrong about this, but I might also be the shitbag you're describing.
Wow. But it sounds like you went to the military because you wanted that challenge. It sounded like that was your initial mission. It's like, yeah, I want to do something real, do an impact, change people. Like, yeah, I can do this out here. And then you come across that adversity.
Yeah, it was definitely not the adversity I expected in the Army, right? I had expected that, and it is true, I had a lot of trouble not smiling when I stand in attention, right? My about face was too bouncy. That's I had that kind of trouble. But I have to say, the amount of soldiers who are struggling through the drama of that kind of thing in the military, when a commander says you need to be investigated, and the sort of policies and procedures related to that, that brought so many people into my office at my next duty station, and I totally got it.
We'll be right back, but let's take a little break for a moment. Do you want to bring the 2020 perspective insights to your team, community group, or company? This season, we're opening the door to talk with you about your failures and engage in a dialogue with the community that matters to you.
For this season only, we're running a special offer called the Failure to Findings Talk, where we can help you learn from failure and build a culture around being a successful failure.
Reach out to us at hello@the2020perspective.com and let us know you're interested in the Failure to Findings Talk. Again, that's hello@the2020perspective.com.
Let's fail out loud together.
That's cool. That made you more relatable. And, not to talk about myself, but I get where you're coming from, because going through situations like that, I can totally relate to that. I think about all the crazy bosses I've had over the year. I'm like, there's no way that I've ended up with all these crazy bosses in a decade. What the heck? I mean, I know that some of it is me, but I also think it helps push me to be able to help other people who have really bad situations at work too. I can understand, I can totally empathize. So it sounds like you are becoming an even better psychologist because of this craziness that you had to go through.
Yeah, I think so. And I was becoming a better follower and a better just sort of professional person in the workplace, right? The deal in terms of working with someone who doesn't accept you necessarily as you are, who you recognize some tension, it's not to ignore it and drive on in a very Pollyannish way. It's to sort of think through the situation and come up with a strategy and hold the wheel, right? Don't be kind of reactive. And just as much as I heard those voices going through it, I did also hear the people who, like an independent investigator and the guy who finally said, okay, you're going to the 101st Airborne, you're going to go to the Combat Aviation Brigade. But those people really calmly looked me in the face. I also understood what it means when a superior, quote unquote, officer or superior person tells you, you can do this, how much that cuts through the noise. So I was really able to recognize those situations again in the future, and then able to give that to other people. It really does matter what you say to people when they're hearing a lot of poopy stuff about themselves.
It sounds like you did learn a lot about, you kind of weaved in some of the lessons that you took away. What are some of the other ways that your perspective has changed in life and work and your practice based on your experience in the Army?
Well, so here's what I'll say. If that was the end of the story, I'm not sure that I would have learned anything.
Okay.
Other than, I think my takeaway would have been, you're a weaselly weasel and you'll always be found out. I honestly think if that's where the story ended, that would just be it, right? And it doesn't matter how much shining and sparkling and showing off you do. Ultimately, you're all cake and no whatever, all frosting, no cake, octopus on skates. These things that sort of rang in my head,
I love these phrases, by the way.
I've never heard octopus on skates. I'm definitely going to.
Oh my gosh, I think about it every 3 days. The phrase octopus on skates, right? You just want to go in so many directions, and you've got all these ideas. It's just a mess. But yes, so after that, I went down to the 101st with the idea of fill it and kill it in my head, but not the fill it and kill it that I had approached the internship with, which was razzle dazzle, front and center as much as possible. It was listen to what people want and need and do your job, do the groundwork, right? Nobody's going to come to you as a psychologist, even if you're assigned to a unit and you're a brigade staff officer. You have to do all the work to go to all the different companies and battalions, and you have to gain their trust over time. You not only have to do well with your patients, but you have to be flexible to respond to things that aren't within your lane and as if they're in your lane. I went to the 101st, deployed with the unit by myself to Afghanistan for 8 months. And at the end of it, when I'm getting my Bronze Star and this amazing day in Afghanistan, I'm yes. And I just wanted to mail it.
Yes.
And I thought, no, Rosie, this is about you and your unit and all the work you've done and all the other units you've supported out here. Because once you got out there, not everybody has a psychologist. And they're like, hey, can we borrow yours? And my commander's like, yeah, Rosie's great. Take her. You know, if you guys lost a soldier, oh, great. You can borrow her. She's great. And I was just hustling, right? And it sort of all came full circle that, no, I could do this. And it did go really well. And, you know, just because someone doesn't believe in you doesn't mean that you're not obligated to find the people who do and just work it out, right?
So if you put Rosie from internship to Rosie at deployment against each other in like a compare contrast column, what would you say is kind of one of the more significant differences between the old you and that you?
That's a good question. So I kept a lot. I still think I had a lot of stuff about the old me that couldn't go away, right? Like I still made it my job to be a breath of fresh air to people in the military. I was going to approach them with this, I'm an officer, like you need to, I still brought that kind of razzle dazzle, like, hey, like really excited to talk to you. If you're a commander or, you know, a private that we're about to redeploy, like you're going to get the still same refreshing, I respect you, I'm energized to be with you kind of thing. But I didn't pick many arbitrary kind of ways to show off at all. Like there were just things that you needed to get done, and you show off by doing the work and coming up with the answer that a commander needs. I think Rosie in internship didn't realize how much she was relying on the people around her for judgment, you know, to sort of either to measure how I'm doing against them or to just help me know what the right thing to do. I developed this other voice in my head that said, okay, the right thing to do is to get up and be seen exercising.
Yeah, it sounds like some of this was kind of like humbling, the column 1 versus column 2.
Yeah, I think it was humbling. I think it was also like, be less naive, right? Like I was naive enough to think that everybody cared whether you finished a postdoctoral residency in clinical psychology or not. And the truth is nobody in the military cares. They just understand whether their soldiers want to talk to you or not, right? They understand whether or not you can come and, like, we had a couple of different incidents. We had a woman in our unit was murdered by another person in our unit. We had 2 Apache helicopters crash, and you get a call and you have to show up and be able to talk to a hangar full of people, half of which knew that person really well and half of them didn't know him at all. Half of them have some conspiracy theory about what actually happened, and half of them don't care. And you have to be able to talk to that whole group in a way that makes them all able to turn around and go and do their jobs that day. And that kind of, you can't plan for those things. There's no way to make yourself perfect at those things. You just have to be able to trust your instinct. And the humility comes from knowing that you can't, like, finding all these arbitrary things to be perfect. You might miss those most important opportunities that you could never plan for.
Do you think that, you know, the getting clicked into the AWOL, what do you call it, discipline chain, review chain?
Yes.
Do you think that almost exposed you to the reality that you needed to really reevaluate and reposition kind of your growing? Or do you think you would have gotten that type of perspective shift if, you know, that person hadn't reported you as AWOL and you didn't get, you know, clicked into that larger thing?
You know, so because that happened, I did miss out on some opportunities that I think would have been formative as well.
Okay.
So one of the reasons you go to New York from DC is because, and this is sort of obscure, Walter Reed doesn't really have a garrison community, and you go to New York to Fort Drum, to the 10th Mountain Division, which is one of the sort of leading infantry divisions, and you work in one of their crazy, chaotic clinics where they're dealing with all the kinds of problems that, you know, and all the kinds of challenges and evaluations and things that you would be dealing with at the 101st. So one of the things she kept saying to me was, you missed out on the most formative part of the residency by doing what you did. So you're going to be less prepared than other people when you go to this next unit. So that was in my head too, that the supervisor out there is amazing, you know, and the opportunities there to work with line unit commanders are amazing. And I missed out on that. You know,
so the curriculum was going to take care of you, but it sounds like you almost crafted your own curriculum, your own experience through that. I mean, probably less pleasurable or, you know, less intentional.
Very Miley Cyrus, like going in like a wrecking ball. Yeah. But here's what's also true. I know that there's not a day that they don't think, wow, she was able to go on and do that stuff because we were hard on her. Right? I don't think I won anything, like, because people just aren't the villains of their own stories, you know? So I know that I'm not in my own story. I know that they're not in my, to them,
Yeah.
they did the right thing. And if anything worked out about my life, I can thank them later, right? And I think that's important to keep in mind. And that's good. That's sort of the way it should be, right? That your failures for you become successes, even if they aren't, other people don't see it that way.
And so we're talking now, we're reflecting back then. How long kind of did it take for you to transform that quote failure, those experiences, into the lessons and the life that you lead now?
Oh man, it took a Bronze Star at 6,000 feet in the air in Afghanistan. Like that's honestly what it took. And I'm not. It's not that I have a guilty conscience, but it will always be sort of something in the back of my head that I'm like, yeah, I kind of screwed that up. I own it now. I'm so glad for the way it turned out, but I try to hold that diathesis in mind. Like, you screwed that up and it worked out great.
Well, it also sounds like, and I love the way that you just described it. It's not necessarily time that has changed it. It's an act. It was a thing. It was an achievement that put it into a different context.
Definitely. And I like to believe that I'm someone who could own it if things hadn't worked out, but I don't truly believe that about myself. And I still don't talk about it that much. It's only become funny and to me, like in the last week. And next week it might not be funny to me, but
in the last week? Wow, lucky us.
Yes, when I first went to Fort Campbell to the 101st, I thought, I have to intentionally leave out this information. And it went on for a year that I thought I just wasn't telling people before I realized nobody asked, hey, did you finish your residency or not? They asked, how's my soldier? Did you visit this person in jail? Like, do you think this person's going to kill his wife? Do you think this person's going to crash a helicopter? They don't ask you all this other stuff. And it took me a good year of being there to realize it wasn't me withholding the information, that nobody cared. Yeah. So I was like just snuggled up my own butt and living there.
So let's talk a little about Rosie.
One of the things, I don't know much about the Army world. Only from the outside, and to me, I always imagined it as being very strict and tucking your bed corners in and folding your washcloths in the exact precise way. And I just automatically thought, that's not where I belong. It is definitely never someplace. I am so appreciative of people who serve. Thank God for them. But it's never something that I feel like I could do, because it's so strict and it doesn't seem creative, because like what Rosie says is they're policing minor things so that everyone stays in line and kind of conforms to the rule. Because if people start doing their own thing and making up their own rules and don't adhere to the overarching world that they've created, then that's when chaos ensues. And that chaos leads to them not focusing on the objective or the mission at hand. And it wouldn't fly with me, I don't think.
See, I mean, I don't think I'm ever going to be in that kind of position, but I think I would really dig it.
Why?
Because, man, I love rules. I love structure.
Weirdo.
I'm such an ENTJ. I just love, like, being able to say, like, and here are the list of rules, and if you do all these things, you are a good person, you are doing the right thing. I was like, sweet. I can learn all these rules. I could do this. Sweet. And so I could see myself, just like Rosie, seeing, you think you wouldn't fit, but the exuberance of falling in line and being a part of the squad and doing what's demanded of you and rising to expectations, I could see myself loving it. But, I think I also would fall into the pitfall of overconfidence that, you can nail all these other things, but this other stuff that doesn't seem important to you, you'll let fall by the wayside. And that's the thing that would also kill me about working in a military context, is that you have to take it all. You can't pick and choose. And while I would certainly 100% do the things I agree with, I also see myself in Rosie, and that the things I don't agree with or the things I don't care as much about, I would also cut some corners and probably get court-martialed for it.
in my head, I look at it like in the corporate world, if I'm going to translate, Army world into the corporate world, in a way, it's just magnified as far as rules and hierarchy and working for quote unquote the man. And I have learned, I have been broken down. I feel my creative ENFP brain has totally been broken down in my last decade in the corporate world to be able to know enough to know how to play the game and be successful in it. But that doesn't mean that it naturally just feels good to me. And I can only imagine that in Army military world, it's just amplified.
What Rosie identified is that the community and the peer group that she was in was part of her success and also a reason of her failure. And, a lot of times people turn the gaze inwards when they fail at something and they blame themselves or they blame the context, but they fail to account for the community that connects to them. And, that community could be your parents, it could be your friends, it could be your partner, but it's also people who have been through this situation before. It's about people on message boards who encourage you to, try it again or try this differently. And that community nature, success is not done alone. It's done in a community. So I took that away as a really important kind of like life realization for her and for, me and the people that I associate with and the people that I surround myself with partially determine my success. Thanks to No BS Brass Band for the Bang & Show music. Check them out at nobsbrass.com. And subscribe on your favorite podcast player or follow us on Facebook to get the newest failures delivered right to your ears. And may your failures be spectacular.